Okay, guys, we're going to get started. Thank you for your patience. I just wanted to make sure that everyone was able to get logged in and had the audio set up and everything. So welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Lighthouse Technologies. The topic of today's webinar is Metrics That Matter, Keeping Your Software Projects on Track. My name is Lindsay Wolanczyk. I am the Technical Account Manager here at Lighthouse. I know I've had the pleasure of meeting a few of you and really happy that you were able to join. And if I haven't met you yet, I hope to meet you soon. Before I begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and everyone is on mute. So if you're eating your lunch or you're at your kid's doctor's appointment, we cannot hear you, so don't worry. Questions will be answered after the presentation, but if you have a question, please type it in the chat with the presenter box in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And you can ask our presenters whatever you would like, if it's about the presentation, or if you just want to know what their favorite color is, or if they think the Browns are going to win this week. And if you're having technical problems, please use the chat to notify us. You know, it's not very beneficial if you guys can't hear or see what we're doing, so we don't want to waste your time. So please let us know if you're having some technical problems. And finally, I'm going to introduce our presenters. So Julie Hagen is the Senior Practice Manager here at Lighthouse. Julie has over 20 years of industry experience and is amazingly talented when it comes to creating solutions to resolving client problems. She uses a very hands-on, risk-based, metrics-driven methodology. Julie has actually played a key role in a lot of large-scale projects here at Lighthouse, as well as throughout her career, and she really does tap into that knowledge and those experiences to solve problems for us today. Jeff Van Fleet is our fearless leader here at Lighthouse. He has over 30 years of software and QA experience. And if you know Julie and Jeff, you'll know that I have to mention that Jeff is older than Julie. That is very important.
By a lot. A decade. Can we think about that? A decade.
Jeff actually founded Lighthouse back in 2000 and has continued to grow the company while driving a work hard, play hard culture. And if you've ever seen us at any trade shows or if you've come to any of our roundtables, you'll know that we do have a very fun, play hard culture. We like to drink, but we also work very hard. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff and let him take it away.
Thank you, Lindsay, once again for the awesome introduction. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate you taking time today and spending part of your day with us. We hope you find the day valuable. When we're doing these live with people, we like to keep it interactive through this webinar kind of mode. It's a little harder to do that, but you know, as Lindsay said, please ask questions in the chat box. We'll move through the material, and then at the end, we've got a whole probably 10 minutes left at the end or so to answer questions that you guys bring up. So with that, let me talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to just talk about what's the value of measuring here, and we'll start with a waterfall kind of world because a lot of people are transitioning legacy systems from the waterfall world to an agile world. Then we'll move into agile because there's some differences, and we want to be able to talk about that. We'll talk about tools, and we'll talk about how we do it here, just to give you an example of what you may be able to do in your own organization. So it's kind of fun today because we've got people from organizations all across the United States. I see Canada logged in there. Hey, Pete. And it's fun seeing you all out there, and so it's great connecting.
And so, today we are actually live from a customer location, which is a lot of fun as well.
We're up in Cleveland in a conference room with a big giant window in front of us. Feels like we're on a radio set right here. So yeah, it's kind of fun. So if all of a sudden something happens weird, it's because we're off-site today. So anyhow, look at these questions. So do you know in your organization if testing's working for you? Are you collecting data and metrics today but not using it? A lot of people, you know, we can think of a lot of things we want to collect. So are you collecting things but then just because it's easy to collect, or are they useful to your organization? And do you have a test planning process that's based on these kind of objective criteria that you have, okay, that you're collecting. And these are the kind of things that we're going to talk about today, and hopefully answer those questions for you. So really, why measure in the first place? I think we think of it, it really lets you know how you're doing today, but it's also lets you set the course for improving and measures yourself, allows you to measure yourself as you move forward into that future state where you're maybe more efficient, you're more effective, the quality's increased, those kind of things. You know that old saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think that's really why we're all about measuring.
Yeah, that's a statement that we believe to the core,
yeah.
I would say, here at Lighthouse.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a principle, one of the principles of the company here.
Yeah.
So this testing maturity level from the TMMI, if you've not heard of TMMI, you can just Google it. There's 5 levels. We're going to kind of go through quickly each of these levels, but just to give you a sense, as you get more mature, you're really moving from left to right, that initial state, over to potentially even optimized, maybe not that far. But as you do that, you may begin to move the organization from a reactive state where you're just detecting defects to way on the right, you're now proactive and you're putting in place measures, not measures and metrics, but activities to prevent defects from actually being injected into the process at all. And what it does is it really moves your testing organization from sort of a testing-only organization to a quality assurance organization across your entire software enterprise.
Right.
Yeah, so let's step forward here and let's just talk about these different levels. So level 1, and if you're familiar with the Carnegie Mellon maturity model, the CMMI, if you're familiar with that, these mimic that kind of state where level 1 is really, it's ad hoc. Nothing's really written down. I don't have any processes in place, and so we're real reactive. And we see a lot of organizations probably unintentionally in this state. Mm-hmm. And so maybe they aren't documenting test cases. They rely on their subject matter experts to write and maybe just execute test cases, but nothing's written down. Therefore, it's really hard to repeat anything.
Yes. It happens unintentionally in organizations that are very schedule-driven. So time to market is really important to those organizations, and it works for a while, but it's not scalable.
Right. So then when you move up to the maturity scale, you get to level 2, which is really now managed, which I think of as you have some core processes that are written down, and those processes are being executed at the project level. So because you've got a strong test lead, let's say, on a project, or a strong Scrum Master, project manager on that project, you are documenting the process, and your team on that project is executing that. But it's not consistent across the organization. So level 3 then moves us consistent across the organization, and you're applying training, and you're now beginning to look at not just functional testing, but things like load testing, different variations of performance testing, security testing, those kind of things. And you're putting in place peer reviews, or we refer to them typically as inspections. But I think at level 3, you just maybe have one-on-one peer reviews. When you get up to level 4, there's some activities that are now advanced peer reviews where you're now beginning to do a formal inspection, thereby removing the defects more thoroughly, if you will. And then you've got a feedback loop where you're now learning and you're adjusting your training based on the kind of defects that you're discovering in the process. And that's what's happening at level 4. And when you finally get to level 5, and most organizations don't even strive for level 5, we ask most organizations to strive for level 3 with a few level 4 kind of things. Would you say, Julie?
Yes, I think that's fair.
And level 5 is really statistical process control. And those of you that run manufacturing shops, you'll understand that. But in the IT world, we typically strive to get to that level. So really, what we want you to take away here is there is a maturity model improving your organization allows you to go from being reactive and chaotic to proactive and controlled, yeah. I was thinking, what's the opposite of chaotic? Chaotic? So, yeah, great. So at Lighthouse, we like to look at, so what happens in the organization? If you begin to move up that maturity scale, what happens to your organization? And we put this chart together to sort of describe that. That orange line, if you will, is the plan line. So whether you're, let's just pick an example, you're measuring planned cost, if you will, of testing on your project. The blue dots represent the difference between plan and actual. So it's sort of the delta there, okay, the deviation from the plan. I planned to spend $100,000 testing this application. Turned out most of the time I'm overrunning. I'm spending 120 or 150 or 200,000. Every once in a while there's a blue dot below the line, and I'm spending less. I know. So as we've got a few slides with this kind of concept, but what we want you to understand is as you begin to measure, you can now begin to actually plot where are your blue dots. And this chart works really well. You can see across the bottom is test process maturity. So it works really well for your organization, whether you're looking at quality, like delivered defects there, or you're looking at the cost, or if you're looking at the schedule or effort of your team to perform that. So you can see at level 1, hey, the chart's pretty wide, right? I'm not only going to not meet my plan a lot, but I'm going to be over my plan. I'm overrunning my cost or schedule, or maybe I've got an issue with production level defects. So as we pop through these next few slides, think of your organization and pick one metric, whether it's cost, maybe you're an agile shop and it's velocity, and I want to measure velocity. So if you think about this, or maybe it's production level defects. I've got a quality problem with one of my products, and I want to reduce the number of production level defects that we're delivering into production. And boy, that's redundantly redundant.
And here at level 1, you're really inconsistent and unpredictable, right? So that's why you can see, one of those blue dots is just a little bit over plan. Maybe it was 10% over, but you've got others that are more like 20, 30, 40, 70% over. So not only are you overrunning plan, you're not able to predict very effectively by about how much you're going to overrun it, depending on the project. Because
you really probably don't have measures. So most level 1 organizations don't have any measures in place. Therefore, the ability to predict is really ad hoc.
Yes.
And as your organization, I know several of you have organizations with 10, 15, 20, 50, even more testers. As your organization's larger, this problem is just exacerbated. So as we move through here, you can see level 1. As we get to level 2, it gets tighter. And if you notice, the plan line's starting to drop, which means not only are you getting more predictable, as Julie said, but you're getting more efficient. Therefore, you're saying, I can do it with less work, or my planned number of production defects is less than it used to be, okay? And level 3, it's even more defined and tighter as you get through level 4 and then level 5. So the key to this is, as measures in your organization, you can begin to track plan versus actual of some key metrics. We're all about being really pragmatic here at Lighthouse, and would encourage you to do the same. So don't pick 15 metrics, pick 3. And pick the ones that are impactful to your business, the most impactful to your business. Like I said, whether it's the velocity and throughput of your agile teams, or whether it's production quality, or whether it's a cost-conscious organization and it's about, hey, how do I deliver this quality but maintaining or lowering my cost structure.
Right.
And remember, obviously, you can't manage what you don't measure. So that's, like Julie said, it's kind of a key principle for us here at Lighthouse, and it's important that you begin to, if you're not already doing this, you begin to acknowledge that, if you will, and then embrace it. That's the word I was looking for, embrace it. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Julie, and I know you're already tired of hearing from me. So
Okay. So if you've been to a Lighthouse webinar before, who thinks that you're not going to continue to hear from him while I'm in my section? Sorry, just had to throw that out there. But anyway, so we're going to be discussing applying metrics, and Jeff mentioned this in the agenda, in both a waterfall and an agile environment. We know almost everybody today is using some form of an agile methodology, but there are still some waterfall-based organizations out there. So we're going to address that too, and we're going to start with that.
And a lot of our customers are both, right? I mean, the legacy systems are still maintained waterfall.
Yep.
Yeah. Right. So good.
Okay, at Lighthouse, we have this concept that we refer to as a quantifiable test plan. So what does that mean? What we mean by that is that we use objective criteria to scope the test effort versus relying on, well, we did a project of about this same size a year ago, and, here's what we needed, so this one might be about, 20% bigger, so gut feel, the effort looks like this.
Or I've got 3 people available.
Right.
Okay, we'll just use those 3 people.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of better than nothing, but it's not very objective or quantitative. So in a waterfall world, you have all the requirements defined up front, right? So you can use them for this purpose of quantifying things like your effort. So that part of waterfall for purposes of scoping is kind of good.
Yeah, right.
Right.
You know what all your requirements are generally before you start.
Right. So knowing that allows you to estimate about how big and even about how complex, although it's an estimate, the solution is likely to be. So you can use your requirements, use cases, and user stories as a variable in this equation for how much work are we going to have. When you have code available to you, either in part or in whole, because maybe you're testing a legacy application, you can use code analysis to get that estimate a little bit tighter.
Yeah, so the key is how big is this thing, right?
Right.
Because if it's 1,000 lines of code, well, you're going to put one level of effort to it. If it's 1,000,000 lines of code, you're going to maybe put a little harder effort and more people, more resources at it.
Yes, the key to a quantitative plan is how big and how long. So how big is this thing, and how long do we think, based on data available to us, it will take the team that we have to do that amount of work, if that makes sense. Development team maturity plays an important role as a variable in determining how much work you have, because more mature teams will inject fewer defects than less mature teams, right? And they'll remove more of them. So why do we care? It's because defects drive rework, and that rework needs to be planned for. Now, it's rarely ever in a plan because
Right.
we often just don't think like that. But think about it. If you have defects, something has to be fixed, something has to be retested. That's work that you didn't plan for. So at Lighthouse, we like to include an estimate of that work in the plan in the first place.
And work with the development team. Again, we're on the waterfall section here, so for
Right.
those of you that are all agile, we'll get to that in a minute. If you're hybrid, this applies, right? But it's really working with the development organization to talk through what's the remediation time to fix these defects as we discover them, and then our effort is to predict and estimate how many defects do we think we're going to find during the process.
Yeah, so those things, I guess it's kind of a gold, red, and green circle represent really the how big is it. Then we get to how long in our quantifiable test plan. So you understand that based on historical performance, but you only know how long it's been taking your team to do the X amount of work if you've been tracking it, right?
Good point.
So we're talking about metrics here today. So those are some metrics that we do recommend tracking, which you'll see here in a little bit, so that we can use that information in our quantifiable plan. Then we take a look at risk profile, because what happens if we've estimated all this work, we know how big it is, we know how long it's going to take, and it's going to take 2 or 3 months longer than the amount of time that we have to get it out the door. Well, now you have to make some risk-based decisions because you can't test everything, right? So at Lighthouse, we do that based on a risk profile of, where is the solution the most complex, Where do we think the solution is the most fragile? What's the business criticality within the solution? So those are the things we look at when building that kind of a plan.
And we can at any point in time, if you've got questions as we go through this, jot them down. You can send them to us over on the left-hand side, or you can shoot us an email or give us a call. We'll give you our contact information at the end.
Yeah, and I know I spend a fair amount of time here, but it's because when we're talking about metrics, you're going to see we're going to be talking about comparing actuals to plan.
Right.
And you want your plan to be a concrete, viable plan so that comparison is a useful one. Okay, so now that we have a quantifiable plan, we're tracking metrics to report against that plan throughout all of our testing activities. So at Lighthouse, we've organized our metrics into 4 key categories. So you'll see that here: test progress, quality, efficiency, and effectiveness. And what we did is we built a dashboard to help us manage and report that data. So if you're not doing any metrics today, it's okay. We have to start somewhere. And the place most organizations start is with test progress. That's basic. What was my plan and where am I against the plan? Against things like, how many test cases did we write compared to how many we thought we were going to write? How many were executed compared to how many we plan to execute? Where are we against the schedule, right? You guys all get that. Quality metrics are designed to report really key information related to defects, which most everybody does. How many have we found? What's the priority of them? But something you can also use quality metrics for is to get some insight into what's happening in the development team, because we're waterfall right now, right? So we're not in an integrated team. We're Dev and QA are next to each other. So that visibility doesn't always exist without some tracking mechanism to lean on to understand leading indicators of trouble that might be coming upstream from the development process. For example, if it's taking 2 or 3 times as long to remediate defects for retest as was planned for.
Yeah, so that kind of 2 points there. One is, in your plan, you actually planned for time to remediate, which means your test team's built that in and your development team has built that in. And part of our goal in having these conversations with you all and our customers is really to articulate the integration of these plans and why it's important that we cover both of these topics so it's an integrated plan.
Right. Efficiency and effectiveness are a little bit more mature concepts, something people implement after they have gotten their feet wet a little bit and tracking metrics in general. Efficiency is about how productive is my team and are they as productive as I planned for them to be. That's directly related to the cost of testing, right? If we're inefficient, then testing is going to cost more, and that's something that you want to know.
And on the next slide, we'll give you some examples of some of these metrics so you can take something away here, sort of pragmatic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then effectiveness is all about, is the testing working? It's still interesting to me when we talk to organizations sometimes, the blank looks that you get when you say, how do you know if it's working? How do you measure success in your testing? And often they're not quite sure what to say. It's just straight up, is it working? Because we can write and execute test cases, hundreds of them if we want, and if they don't find the defects, then the testing didn't work.
Right, and so a takeaway for you from our conversation today is think about your organization and ask about your testing organization. Is it focused on executing test cases, or is it focused on finding defects? And it might sound like a nuance, but the behavior of your testers will change when they're focused on finding defects than just executing blindly at test cases.
It will.
Yeah, I mean, very much.
Okay, so still waterfall, right? So have your brain on waterfall. These are some of the, Jeff said earlier, don't do 15 or 30, what are the 3 to 5 most important metrics that you can use, and these are some of our favorites here at Lighthouse in each of these areas. So in progress, just straight up plan versus actual test case execution is a really good place to start with a key metric.
So if you have thousands of test cases to execute, this shows you quickly, hey, after day 3, I expected to be executing 80 a day. Am I at 240 or am I at 200? Am I, and so it just gives you that indication really quickly. If you only have 35 test cases or 50 test cases, this one's just not that relevant.
Right, it's too small.
Yeah,
agreed. From a quality perspective, we recommend looking at defects by component if that's something that you're not doing today. We have found that breaking a solution into, don't go crazy, no more than 10 logical components and looking at where the defect density is within those components is useful, because 1 or 2 areas, often just one, often jumps way out as having far more defects than the other areas. And so, and you can generally find a root cause for that, right? Like perhaps the requirements weren't as well defined in that area, or perhaps the development team is divided up amongst components, and maybe one team is a little bit weaker and could use some training. But there's generally a root cause. But if you don't track that information and therefore you don't know, then you won't be looking for that root cause that could make a big impact. And
that's, you think about that root cause analysis is part of moving up the maturity scale and trying to make the organization now more proactive.
Yeah, and then, of course, defect removal efficiency is a very common quality metric in the waterfall world as well. In the efficiency space, I talked about this a minute ago, cost. That's really about how much is the test process costing you, and can it cost less by becoming more efficient. And effectiveness, in that space, we like to track a metric that we call mean time to defect. Mean time to defect is looking at, across everybody who's testing against a particular solution, how often is a defect being found? Early on in a test cycle, it's pretty often. It can be, every few minutes, if you will. But over time, you expect the solution to become more stable, and that should stretch out. So when you get into the nobody's finding a defect until, it's been 8 to 10 hours of testing, then the solution is getting pretty stable, and you can begin to feel good about the fact that the testing is working, is effective.
So you might imagine if you release to production and you're finding defects every 15 or 30 minutes, what your users are going to experience once they get out there. So it's a really good feel for, hey, what's going to happen once we go live.
Okay, so on the left-hand side of this dashboard, you can now see the test process. So all these metrics we're talking about get collected and compared at each step of that process: test design, test writing, test execution, et cetera. And then we're tracking actuals all along the way, so that if you have early indicators of trouble, you still have time to adjust. So then we learn from all this information as well. So it allows us to become, remember the blue dots, more consistent and more predictable. And now we're smarter in building our future quantifiable test plan, because now we've got some history to go by that we can inject into our next planning cycle.
So, for example, if you have a test cycle and you're building 400 test cases and it took you 400 person hours to build it, it's taking you an hour per test case on average to do that. So that piece of data is really useful when you're going to go do the next test plan. And that feedback loop, and then you would build that test plan assuming, hey, it's going to take us an hour. What happens the next time the solution's different, or the team is different, and it takes us 40 minutes, or it takes us an hour and a half.
Yep.
Right?
And if you're automating, track that as well.
Absolutely.
In a waterfall world, you find yourself automating large regression sets.
Right.
You're going to want to know about historically, how long does it take us to do that?
Right. That's right. Good point.
Okay, let's switch our brain off this waterfall mindset and move on to Agile, because, let's face it, almost everybody's Agile, right? In some way, shape, or term. Okay, so Agile has changed the game a little bit. There's no real handoff like there used to be from development to QA. We're in integrated teams now, and it's the collective we that are responsible for quality. So there's some great things about that a lot of organizations are benefiting from. But one thing we don't have anymore is a full set of requirements from which to scope.
Right.
So it's changed the way that we scope test work.
Yep.
To be honest. So we're going to talk about that in a couple slides. I want to point out, though, the extreme value that Agile brings by driving the business to be involved now in the prioritization of the work. So it means they're getting what they want faster. And the good news, we can still use robust metrics to manage through measuring, even in Agile, because the principles of measurement are still the same.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Let's talk about, let's level set first before we move on sprint teams. So when we talk about Agile, at least when we're talking in theory, we all seem to talk as if there's a single sprint team.
To be fair, we do.
We do,
yeah.
Even when the organization's massive, right?
Right.
So that's not reality. Almost nobody, I do know one company, but almost nobody has just one sprint team. So this is what it really looks like. These sprint teams are generally working on separate pieces of an overall solution. And then those pieces, and they're not releasing those individual pieces to production every 2 weeks.
Right.
Because they have dependencies and
right.
they don't work without one another. So at some point, those pieces have to be integrated and then tested before that chunk, that epic or whatever it is happens to be, moves on into a production environment. So you've got these on this chart, you can see these 3 sprint teams kind of sprinting along. And then at some point, not necessarily on sprint 3, but at some point.
We just couldn't fit sprint 6 on,
right.
On the slide.
We recommend, and there are different schools of thought on this, but Lighthouse recommends a hardening sprint, a test-only sprint, so that you can get a handle on things that were working that are now broken as the end sprint work was being accomplished.
Right.
So then sprinting on past your hardening sprint, you will ultimately come to a point where you have that integration that needs to take place between these components, and you have regression there as well. So that being said, back to our quantitative test plan, you can't really do it effectively for a 2-week sprint.
No.
It's not worth your time.
Right,
exactly. But you can do it for those hardening sprints and for those integration and regression cycles when the whole solution is getting integrated together.
That's right. I mean, as everybody talks about testing in the Agile world, everybody, like Julie said, everybody tends to simplify the conversation. But in reality, as we've talked to dozens and dozens of customers, everybody's trying to figure it out themselves. And as she said, this hardening sprint is important to let you find all of the problems that occurred, because I did sprint 1, I did the functional testing, I found some defects, they fixed them, we moved some into backlog, some of that backlog got implemented in sprint 2, and implemented some new functionality, it created some more defects, turned into more backlog, got to sprint 3, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in doing that, I never went back and retested, did I break a bunch of stuff from sprint 1 and sprint 2?
Right.
And that's what those hardening sprints are all about.
Right, to drive those defects out as early as possible before they drive additional rework that's going to be exponentially more expensive.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. So I don't want to make it sound like there's zero planning for the in-sprint test work.
Right.
Because there is. You're still, figuring out core things. You still have a plan. What test environments am I going to use? How am I prioritizing defects?
How am I doing performance testing versus functional testing, security testing? How am I building all that into the process? What's
my hardening sprint cadence? Do I need to do one every 6 sprints or every 10 or every 15, depending on how big the solution is that's being built?
Right, or that particular sprint team's velocity.
Right. So in an Agile world, this dashboard still applies. These 4 categories in which we track metrics are still applicable, but some of the detailed metrics in each of these categories are different. So let's take a look at that. In an Agile world, when we talk about progress, we're no longer talking about, okay, how many hundreds of test cases did I plan because I knew all the requirements up front so I could do that. Now we're talking about committed versus done. What's the velocity I planned versus what's the velocity I actually delivered to?
Right. This is not a testing metric.
Right.
This is an integrated team metric.
Right. Now we're an integrated team. Right. It's not a testing metric now.
That's right. most QA organizations in companies are responsible for gathering metrics across the whole SDLC, across the whole software lifecycle. And this is a good example of one in the Agile world.
Right. In Agile in Progress, we're looking at burn down.
Right.
Am I getting through this work at the rate that I expected to, and am I going to make it?
Right, into my 2-week sprint.
Right. And then looking at, if you're an organization that is doing automation, and Agile pretty much forces every organization at some point to begin to consider it if they have not, you want to track how your automation efforts are going versus the plan. So when you embark on an automation initiative, you want to understand what's the goal. What goal makes sense in this environment? Should I be able to get to 80% automation coverage, or will 60 be sufficient because I've got 40% of things that don't make sense to automate for some reason?
Right.
That happens. So if you are automating, we recommend that you are paying attention to what goodness is. If I automated 700 scripts, out of how many? And will automating that many provide the coverage that you need from your automation initiative?
And just to kind of ground that a little more, more additionally, organizations with multiple applications are going to have different goals, and ideally different goals of automation for each of the applications.
Yeah.
You might have a legacy system application that you're not going to automate because you didn't build the hooks into the code when you built the development, and it's not worth the time to go back and do that because you're not releasing very often on the legacy app. But you're going to make business decisions about what are my automation goal, or that's the plan, and you're going to then report percent automated against that. We have a separate webinar on how you go about planning for automation.
In quality, we are still looking at defects per component and DRE,
right.
Even in an Agile world,
because
it still provides the same value and can still be tracked. Efficiency, we're looking at velocity now.
Yep.
We're not looking at how productive is the test team. We're looking at what's the velocity of the sprint team, which is now an integrated team.
Yeah, interestingly, that is a sprint measurement, but there are hardening sprints. Remember, they're test-only sprints.
Right.
The concept of performance of the testing team still applies in a hardening or a regression sprint. So you now have sort of two buckets that you're now looking. You're looking at in-sprint metrics and then call them test-only metrics that might be cumulative for the testing organization.
And now we're looking at the effectiveness of the team. We are the collective we now. So how many defects are we, the sprint team, allowing to be released post-sprint?
Right.
Now, that might not mean production, right, but they made it out of the sprint.
Right. Good point.
Okay, so there's some tools that help us do this. A lot of different tools, right? There's multiple ways. At Lighthouse, we use Jira. We find Jira to be inexpensive and customizable, and that's worked for us. We already had Jira. We built our dashboard on top of it.
Yep.
Most test management ALM tools have reporting functionality to various degrees. We didn't find one that did everything that we wanted, hence the custom dashboard, but a lot of people are able to get what they're looking for their organization out of those tools that they already have.
For basic reporting.
Yes. Right. Custom solutions, you can build something from scratch. That's generally expensive, but also flexible, and you don't have licensing. Or you know what, especially if you're new to metrics, you can just use Excel.
You did it for years.
We did. Yeah, we started with Excel and then automated our Excel solution using our dashboard eventually. But most people know how to use Excel, very little ramp-up time, and if you already have it, you have it. There's no licensing. Okay. How we do it at Lighthouse, I won't spend a lot of time because these are eye charts, but these are just some screenshots from our dashboard for a few of our metrics. So the one here on the left is our test cases planned versus executed.
Plan versus actual.
Plan versus actual.
Right.
Yeah. Yep, just by month. And then over on the right is a cumulative. The reason we do that is to monitor trends. So if you want to follow a trend line to see how you're doing, then a cumulative view is best to do that. And then we've just got a couple more screenshots. There's a quality metric here, total defects discovered, and the priority of those. And then over to the right.
In fact, there's a cumulative for that. We just didn't. We're not going to show you all the metrics.
Not
but
in here.
You can imagine you want to look over time. Is my number of critical defects increasing as a percentage of total defects, or are we getting more mature and therefore we're only finding sort of minors and trivials more frequently now?
And then, we harp so much on this defects by component, we better show that we actually have it, right? So in this example, this is a real customer here, some data that we scrubbed, but you can see that this lamp control component of this particular solution jumped way out with far more defects. And it's interesting how it happens almost every time.
It does.
One area tends to jump way out.
And you mentioned earlier why it happens, but that root cause analysis, this is a really good tool, to really straightforward to do. But for every defect, you have to record what component that defect impacted. And so that's how you begin to collect this piece of data.
And if you're changing functionality and lamp control, it's probably risky because it's the most fragile. So you want to know that so you can concentrate your testing efforts in that space.
Good point.
Okay, so let's review. Here's what we discussed. We talked about why do you do it? What's the value of a metrics-oriented approach? We talked about how you apply metrics in waterfall and how it looks different from the way you apply metrics in Agile at the detail level, but that the principles of measuring are still the same. We talked about a few tools that you can use to capture and record metrics.
And if you're not doing it, use Excel.
Use Excel, right? If you're not doing it today, just use Excel. Give us a call if you want to know how to get started with an Excel-based approach. And we talked about how we do it at Lighthouse, which is just one way of doing it. So I'm going to turn back over to Jeff here, and he'll spend just a few minutes before we wrap up talking about why we do what we do at Lighthouse.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And so don't forget, before I talk about this for a couple seconds, if questions popped up for you, make sure you send them to us. I see a few of them popping in, so keep throwing them at us, and then we'll get to them here in a couple of seconds. A lot of customers want to understand who we are as an organization and why we exist, and this chart really says it for us. It's because Gartner tells us that we spend $360 billion a year on software, on building software systems, but almost $100 billion of that is thrown away on failed and canceled projects. And so our whole existence here at Lighthouse is helping you all solve that problem, because if we can help you save 25% of your software spend like that, it's going to really help your organization. And frankly, it's going to help everybody improve across the globe. And there's key principles, and we talked to a lot of detail in the webinar today about how we apply some of these principles, but it's really hard to build large enterprise software systems. And so as the world moved to smaller and smaller components like Agile does now with 2-week sprints, it makes it better, faster, easier. You can find things quicker. You got the business involved quicker. But if you don't put measures in place, it's easy for projects to get off track, and you can't course correct, right? So you want to have sort of leading indicators that you want to eventually get to leading indicators that can allow you to course correct and help inform the project managers, the program managers, and Scrum Masters on activities that they can apply to get the program back on schedule. What we've noticed for ourselves and for our customers is there's a cultural impact to these kinds of changes, and I write a monthly blog on leadership that talks about how you build trust and transparency in your organization to allow you to do these measures, but not isolate individuals and make them feel like they are responsible personally for that failure. It's a process thing. It's a training thing. So you have to build a culture that is that's trusting, and put the right people in the culture, and really the earlier you find defects in the development process through things like hardening sprints or user story inspections or code analysis, there's a 5X rule, and we talk about that in lots of our webinars, that shows an exponential impact that a user story defect will cost $250 to find and fix while you're creating user stories. But if it makes it to production, it's going to cost you more than $30,000 for that one defect. And it's just enormous. And when you're talking about thousands of lines of code and tens of thousands of lines of code, the number of defects is in the hundreds, if not thousands. And these numbers are just astronomical, what it can do to a program. So those are kind of our key principles on how we think. What we do for customers, and really we'll get to you in a second in questions here, is we have a true north testing methodology that we apply. Obviously, we deliver manual and automated testing services, but we help organizations by coming in and doing testing assessments. We have a whole webinar on that. We're glad to talk to you about that, on how we can help you improve your organization. And then organizations have come to us and said, hey, I like what you're doing in terms of managed service, but can you take your methodology and instantiate it into my organization? I don't want to depend on you forever. I just want you to stamp it in here and put it in place, train our people on it, and then get out.
Yeah.
And so that's what we do. We obviously provide full, no kidding, QA consulting services, and we have a practice on the Oracle ERP, frankly, a whole ERP practice that we apply these principles to, but we also do support and maintenance in the ERP world, and then staffing in some areas. So if there's a need you have, don't hesitate to reach out. We're glad to have a conversation with you.
Yeah.
So let me turn this back over to Lindsay.
Yeah, awesome. So we do have a few questions. I'll start with this one. The presentation seems to focus on development. Can you please discuss using metrics for production issues?
Hi, Martin.
I didn't want to say his name. Hi, Martin.
So you're right. This specific webinar is focused on delivering software better. So it's a pre-production kind of message. However, we are, especially with DRE, typically for 90 days, tracking post-release.
So yeah, let's explain what DRE is. So defect removal efficiency for those of you guys. So it's really a ratio, and the top of if you got a pen right there, write it down. If you're driving, don't write it down.
Yeah.
But the numerator is total number of defects discovered before I went to production. The denominator is before plus after production, after I went to production, but for a 90-day window. So,
right.
Okay? And you're targeting, in a business world, you're targeting about a 95% number. So only 5% of defects are making it into production, okay? And you discovered most of them before you get there. And I guess the only thing else I would add to that is you're still prioritizing those defects as critical, majors, minors, and trivials, right? And those criticals are typically showstoppers, like the system's not working, piece of functionality is not working, and I don't have a workaround. And as you get more sophisticated, now you're looking at what's the impact on my help desk and my organization and my customer base, my customer satisfaction, by having these defects in production. So hopefully it helped a little bit answer your question. And if you got more, don't hesitate. Just reach out to us. We're glad to talk more about that.
All right, awesome. So the next question is, if there's one metric that everyone here needs to be tracking, which would you recommend and why?
So I think we have to think about that in the waterfall versus agile mindset, because I think it's different.
Okay.
Potentially. So if you haven't been using metrics at all, it's easiest to start with the progress. So in a waterfall world, that's, a plan versus actual. What I plan to do, it's a test metric in a waterfall world.
Right.
What did I plan to do versus what did I actually do? And in agile world, it's a sprint team metric. It's a velocity metric. So yeah. I think that's my answer.
Okay.
Is start with progress.
My answer, so interestingly, I would have said I think velocity is really critical, the plan versus actual. But I would also say it depends on what your issues are at your particular organization. So if you're having production quality issues, I would start there. and I would measure how many issues are we released into production today on each of the apps, and I would normalize it and divide by something like 1,000 per 1,000 lines of code or per function point something. I would normalize it so we're not just saying, oh, it's 15 and next month it's 25. But I would say I would look at the areas of your business that are most critical for you and focus there first.
Okay, awesome. So next question, are you guys ready?
Sure.
How does metrics-based testing affect the culture of a testing organization?
That's a good question.
Well, Jeff talked a lot about the importance of trust and transparency. So if people think that you are tracking this data in order to hurt them in some way, then that's not good, right?
No.
Then they won't be receptive to the power of the information, the learning that occurs from tracking metrics.
Yeah, we had a customer less than a month ago say, hey, I want to apply some metrics. I want you guys to help us. I want to know which of my developers generate the most defects.
Yes.
We're like, maybe that's not what your goal. Let's talk about what your goal is. What he really wanted was he wanted to know who needs training. Okay, well, that's a different answer than which of my developers sucks the most.
Right.
That's sort of how he painted the picture to us. So we talked about how to do that in a way where you're not pointing the finger at actual individual people because, we all get a little nervous when we're being singled out.
Yes.
So, yeah. So it does
culture
affect the culture.
Right. Yeah. So a trusting and transparent culture will have more success from the beginning with instantiating metrics. A non-transparent culture might have a little work to do there before they get going.
Good question, though.
Okay, next question. It looks like we have time for one more maybe. Outside of testing, what other kinds of benefits can an IT organization see from tracking metrics?
I'm back to the blue dot chart. Consistency and predictability.
Yeah.
IT organizations are delivering software solutions, and it's about delivering software better, not just about test metrics.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think it's the same answer, but I would add to that is your corporation's got strategies and you've got measures around those strategies, and your CIO's got IT organizational metrics and strategies that align with the corporate. So your software organization needs to align as well. If one of those metrics is improved customer satisfaction, for example, well, at this level, we can measure that by looking at how many fewer defects we're delivering to production than we used to deliver.
Yes.
And somebody else will measure, well, what's my real customer sat? But there's things that I think align directly with the whole strategy of the corporation.
Okay. We'll do one more question. I think this one would be beneficial. What software and tools do you recommend to keep track of metrics? Do some integrate better, etc.? I know you guys had mentioned Excel, Jira. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
I mean, we like Jira because it's widely used.
Yep.
I mean, almost every organization we work with is using Jira at some level.
That's right, and it's customizable.
Yeah.
And
has
fairly
a lot
easy.
of plugins.
That's right. It's got a lot of plugins. It's fairly easy to do that. But if you're just thinking that, I still think Excel is the way to go.
Yeah.
But the only problem is you're using something to track defects anyhow, like Jira or HPQC or something. Then you've got to export that data into Excel to run your reports. So,
yeah.
So you just got to think through what are the core things I want to track and what's the easiest place to track them. And Excel or Jira, I guess I would answer the same.
Yeah.
Okay,
Any
great.
other questions out there, Lynn?
No, those were all the questions. You guys are rock stars. So we're going to wrap it up. I know you guys probably have some meetings starting at 1. So on behalf of everyone here at Lighthouse, thank you so much for attending today's webinar on Metrics That Matter. I hope you guys were able to get some nuggets of information and that you found some value in what we had to say. For now, our team is standing by to answer all of your calls. Our main number here is 937-458-0960. Julie's at extension 328, and Jeff is at extension 201. Again, the number here is 937-458-0055, and you can speak with Jeff or Julie at your convenience. We look forward to hearing from you, and hope you guys all have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.